Hello, I'm Maria Georgopoulou. I'm the director of the Gennadius Library here at the American School of Classical Studies. And it is wonderful to be able to host this event in this strange world that we inhabit. This is a hybrid event or hybrid lecture. It is a bit strange to start thinking and understanding the words that we're using. But in any event, it is really a great pleasure to be here and to introduce a colleague and a longtime friend who also happens to be an overseer of the Gennadius Library, Anne McCabe, who is a research associate at the Center for the Study of Ancient Documents at Oxford. She studied Byzantine history, Byzantine philology at Harvard and at the University of Oxford, where she wrote a doctorate on the manuscript transmission of the Greek texts on horses and horse medicine, known as the Hippiatrica. And she wrote her dissertation under the supervision of Professor Cyril Mango. Her dissertation, which is a handbook for veterinarians and horse keepers, and a relatively little-known text, was published as a book entitled The Byzantine Encyclopedia of Horse Medicine, the Sources, Compilation, and Transmission of the Hippiatrica, in the series on Byzantium, Byzantine Oxford Studies on Byzantium in 2007. And according to one reviewer, the book set new standards for those interested in the communication of scientific knowledge and its transmission through the centuries. And he continues, McCabe handles the project with aplomb and leads the reader seamlessly through this labyrinth with clear prose and fine, extensively supported argument. Along the way, she continually displays her depth of learning and love of her subject. In addition to her philological and historical detective work, that includes forays into the materia medica and Byzantine pharmacology, and has worked also as an archaeologist for over a decade at the Athenian Agora excavations, as well as at the Byzantine site of Androna, Alandarin in Syria. And she is currently completing a corpus of dated Byzantine inscriptions from Constantinople and its hinterland, begun by Cyril Mango and Ihor Shevchenko. For those of you who are not Byzantinists, these are giants in the field. And to continue their work is surely a very important feat that Anne has all the tools and the toolkit to bring it to completion. She has recently published a study of the Byzantine funerary inscriptions at the Festion, the Church of St. George in the Athenian Agora, and that was published in 2020. As I already mentioned, Anne, to us at the Gennadius Library, in addition to being a reader and to actually being a wonderful connoisseur of Byzantine manuscripts and rare books, she serves on the board of overseers. She has contributed to the enrichment of the library's collections with precious rare books that she has found on the market, and also some books that belonged originally in the collection of John Gennadius but had been sold. And I wanted here to mention our gratitude because she managed to assure that the library of Cyril Mango, the late Cyril Mango, will find a home here at the Gennadius Library. Her talk tonight beautifully bridges the two sides of Suevias Street, but also the faraway part of the American school at the ancient Agora of Athens. As she's speaking to us on the occasion of a fantastic exhibition, Epos, the Horse in Ancient Athens, curated by the director of the American School, Jennifer Niles. She's also combining this with an intriguing Byzantine textual tradition that sort of brings us closer to the Gennadius, and of course the antiquities of the Athenian Agora. Please join me in welcoming Anne McCabe to the podium, and she will talk on Simon of Athens, 2 Byzantine manuscripts, and the lost bronze horse from the Athenian Agora. Anne.
Anyway, thank you, Maria, for the kind introduction, and thank you also to Jennifer for organizing this wonderful exhibition, which gives us an excuse to talk about horses. Now, I don't need to remind this audience that horses figure prominently in early Greek writing, from the Linear B inventories to the Homeric epics and lyric poetry. But the first prose text devoted specifically to horses and horsemanship was written here in Athens in the 5th century BC by someone called Cimon. And I'm going to talk about him this evening. His text is preserved only in fragments, the longest of which is about 2 pages if you type it out. And then there are a few quotations in later authors. And the long fragment is preserved only in 2 manuscript copies. But in spite of this small amount of text, Cimon is exceedingly interesting. His text is of interest to classicists as a specimen of early Attic prose. It's of interest to archaeologists because of his relation to certain monuments of classical Athens. And it's interesting to Byzantinists too, for its interesting transmission from Athens to medieval Constantinople and down to the present day. And of course, the text is very interesting to horse lovers because it's very good. It's well written and it's full of useful advice. So Cimon appears to have been a recognized authority even in antiquity, and maybe a bit of a celebrity too. The most reliable testimony is that of Xenophon, who mentions him right at the beginning of his own treatise on the art of horsemanship. And Xenophon says with typical modesty that he has a bit of experience, with horses and horsemanship, and so he's going to set down some advice for his younger friends. So this has been taken to mean that he's writing later in life, after he's returned from the great expedition and while he's in exile from Athens, so maybe around 430, in the first decade of the 4th century, rather. And Cimon says, he excuses himself for writing on the subject because he says, Cimon has already written about horsemanship. And Xenophon continues, saying that he won't omit from his own treatise what Cimon has already said about the subject, because it's more reassuring when the advice is shared, when the opinion is shared by 2 experts. And so here is the beginning of Xenophon's text. We shall not erase from our work the conclusions that happen to coincide with Cimon's, but shall offer them to our friends with far greater pleasure in the belief that they're more worthy of acceptance because so expert a horseman held the same opinions as we ourselves. And then Xenophon says that he'll add in whatever Cimon has omitted. So the 2 manuscripts and all mentions by later authors agree that Cimon was from Athens. And here you can see the title of one of the manuscripts, Simonos Atheneu. And the title of his treatise is Peri idus και επιλογής ύπων, or at least that's the title of the fragment that we had, on the form or conformation and choice of the horse. Now, Cimon doesn't tell us anything in the fragment about himself, and so people have tried to identify him. For example, Edward Gerhardt said he must be this charioteer who's labeled Cimon, but this black figured vase is probably a bit early. It may well be that Aristophanes is referring to our Cimon in his play The Knights, where one of the leaders of the chorus made up of knights, of course, is called Cimon. And people have argued that Cimon, the author, must have been Hipparch in 424. That was the year when The Knights was produced. That might be going too far, but it may well be that he's sort of name-checking an eminent horseman who might have been in the audience. There's more evidence from the onomasticon of Pollux, which is a sort of lexicon of Attic diction that was dedicated to the Emperor Commodus at the end of the 2nd century AD. And Pollux mined Simon's text for good Attic usage, and so his lexicon is a source of several quotes. And one of them, which is in a part of the treatise which deals with parts of the eye, begins, "Eyelashes are the hairs that grow on eyelids. The lower eyelids are bare of such hairs. For this reason, Simon reproached the ignorance of Mikon, since he depicted lower eyelashes too in the painting of the horse." And so this gives us evidence that Simon may have been active in the middle of the 5th century BC, because Mikon was not just any painter, he was sort of the George Stubbs of classical Athens, and his works adorned the painted stoa, along with those of Polykleitos, as well as other famous monuments in town, such as the Theseum and the Anakion. And Pausanias tells us that Mikon depicted the Argonauts in the Anakion, which was, of course, dedicated to the Dioscuri, who were patrons of horses, and that he had particularly concentrated his spoudae on a depiction of horses. And Elian also repeats the story. He says, well, it was either Mikon or Apelles, but he said that Mikon was particularly known for his skillful depictions of horses. So Simon was not just a tough critic of works of art, but he seems to have been a patron of art himself. Xenophon identifies him, and he speaks of Simon as though he were already a classic and not a contemporary. He says, Simon was the one who set up that bronze horse near the City Eleusinion in Athens and recorded his own feats in relief on the pedestal, if that's what exetuposen means. Now there's the area of the City Eleusinion it's at the sort of southeast of the Agora, high up on the Pan-Athenaic Way on the slopes of the Acropolis. And why would the horse have been placed there? I mean, it's a prominent position, and horsemen would have ridden by during processions. Xenophon, in his treatise on the cavalry commander, says that it's good in processions for horsemen to make a tour of the Agora, paying homage to the gods at their shrines and statues. They start at the Herms, and they sort of make a tour, and when they're back at the Herms, Xenophon says they should gallop at high speed up to the Eleusinium. So you can imagine horsemen galloping up toward a statue that sort of marked the end of their exhibition. Now, Xenophon doesn't give us any indication of the size of the statue, so we don't know whether it would be sort of half-sized. I mean, maybe in this mid-5th century vase, Athena is very tall and the horse is normal-sized. But here's another horse being sculpted at sort of half-sized. And we can imagine a scene like this with the sculptor at work and maybe someone sitting there criticizing everything that the sculptor did. And, again, we don't know whether it would be a smallish statue or something larger, more like the horses of San Marco. But we have to use our imagination. And then, of course, there's the question of the reliefs on the base. I mean, this is a bit later, but it happens to be in the exhibition next door. A nice base from the Agora. Of course, it would have been more interesting if Simon had his text carved on the statue base, but I'm sure the reliefs were attractive too. Pliny might be referring to the horse statue that Xenophon mentions when he says that the sculptor Demetrius made a statue of Simon as an equestrian, Simon being the first one to write on horsemanship. So he may have gotten the statues confused. Of course, there may have been a second statue that wasn't just a horse, that was Simon on a horse. Demetrius, the sculptor, was known for his realistic style, which Quintilian says Demetrius is blamed for carrying realism too far. and is less concerned about the beauty than the truth of his work. And that's in the 1st century AD. And then in the 2nd century, Lucian of Samosata parodied Demetrius' sculptures and said that they were really ugly and they depicted people, warts and all, instead of in an idealized form. And of course, if indeed Cimon commissioned Demetrius to make a sculpture, a realistic style might have appealed to him, since he was apparently so intolerant of lack of precision in depictions of horses. So the sculptor Demetrius is said to have hailed from the Athenian deme of Allopeki, and this statue base with the sculptor's signature has been identified as being a signature of Demetrius, a base of one of his sculptures, because it preserves not the name, but just part of the deme, allopekethen. Pekethen is all it says, and then it has epis. And it was excavated not far from the City Eleusinion in 1945, and Ben Merritt, who published it, restored the name Demetrius as the sculptor's signature. And more recently, Kathy Kiesling has argued that this is, in fact, part of the base of Simon's dedication of the horse statue. And there is a cutting on the top surface, which seems to be original. The cutting is roughly in the shape of a hoof, not a very big one, not life-sized, but that might add to the argument. Of course, there are no traces of relief on the stone, which was reused as sidewalk paving. Anyway, others are more qualified to talk about bronze statues and relief statue bases than I am. So I'd like to turn to Simon's text, which, as I said, is preserved only in 2 manuscript copies. And they're both dated approximately to the 14th century on the basis of the style of the handwriting. This one is in Cambridge at Emmanuel College, and it's a very sort of frugally copied text. The first part is on palimpsest, reused parchment. The second section, in which Simon's text is contained, is on clean parchment. And this third section is paper. And it's all a copy of the veterinary compilation of the Hippiatrica. But it was heavily used, maybe even in the stable, because there are leather tabs marking where different chapters start, and there are annotations throughout in a hand probably of the 15th century. And these are explanations of tricky words in simpler Greek. And so you can see that in Simon's text especially, the ancient vocabulary needed translation for a reader in the 15th century. And you also see that its vocabulary and grammar tripped up the scribe in many instances. I mean, that things like duals and optatives are copied with a lot of spelling mistakes by this 14th century copyist. So here you can see some of the interlinear glosses in Simon's text. Oh, the manuscript, we don't know anything about how it got to Emmanuel College. I mean, it was probably a gift from a grateful alumnus. Most of the college's collection ended up there that way. But it was there by 1673 when it was collated against Isaac Casaubon's copy of the first edition of the first printed edition of the Hippiatrica. And it's named in those notes as Codex Emmanuelensis. And then there was also a full copy of the text made in the same year, 1673, and that's in the University Library in Cambridge. The other manuscript is in London at the British Library, and the scribe was much better with spelling and grammar and things like that. The text it's a better version of the text, although both manuscripts are independent from one another. So they're both important in reconstituting Simon's words. This manuscript has a note. It's on paper. It's on Eastern paper, a bombacine with no watermarks. And it has a note of possession of a 16th century scribe, John Chalkeopilos of Constantinople. But since he signs his name in Latin, he may have taken the book with him to the west after the fall of Constantinople. And we can trace the ownership of this manuscript from him to Italian cardinals and scholars, all the way down to Hans Sloane. And here's his statue from Sloane Square. And of course, he was the doctor and scientist and collector whose amazing collection formed the core of the British Museum. And Hans Sloane had acquired about 4,000 manuscripts, mainly of medical and scientific interest, which are now in the British Library. And so Simon's text and the Hippiatrica, in which it's copied, obviously fits in with those interests. Humphrey Wanley, who was Hans Sloane's librarian, made a very detailed inventory of the contents of this manuscript around 1700. And so he knew about Simon's text, but it was not published at that point. The text was published for the first time by Charles D'Arenberg, who found it in the Cambridge manuscript, and that was in 1854. And since then, it's been published no fewer than 7 other times, so a total of 8 times. It's been translated into German and into English, and it has received more attention in a way than the rest of the Hippiatrica, of which there's only one modern edition. So Simon doesn't tell us anything in what remains of his text. So we, learn from other authors that he was prosperous enough to have commissioned what must have been a fairly expensive work of art, that bronze horse. We know that he was literate and that he had enough education to write with style. And we also hear that he was confident enough to criticize a famous painter. And his text is also very confidently written, and it's entitled, as I said, "Peri idus και επιλογής ύπου," on the form. Eidos is, of course, the word used for the Platonic forms, but in this case, it's really conformation, the physique of the horse. And he sort of tells you how not to be cheated when you're buying a horse. And he uses the formula "dokei moi," it seems best to me. He uses lots of third-person imperatives and not many conjunctions at all, so it's a very no-nonsense text. And he begins each section with sort of pithy phrases, which sound almost proverbial. And the language of the stables is still a very old-fashioned, very traditional language, and still has its own set of proverbs. So Simon begins, he says, the first lesson when it comes to the conformation of a horse is learn where the horse comes from. And he recommends horses from Thessaly. And that's confirmed by other ancient authors that Thessaly, with its plains and rich grazing, produced big, strong, healthy horses, which were famous. The next, he says, he talks about the size of the horse. He says there are 3 categories: large, small, and good-sized. Then he says, I'm not going to try and tell you which is the best color. It doesn't matter. But it's good, he says, if the mane is just one color, so it's not kind of stripy like a donkey mane, and it should be flowing. And then he says a horse should be short on top, long on the bottom. So its barrel or its trunk should be compact, whereas there should be plenty of distance between the fore and hind legs. He says that way they're more sure-footed. And then he says a good hoof is an asset to a horse, and we still say, no foot, no horse. So I'd like to go back to this discussion of size. He says, there are 3 terms: mega, mikron, evmegethes, so large, small, and good-sized. And then he says, or if you like, symmetron, and that's an interesting word, well-proportioned. And he says, kratiston then pandizo is συμμετρία. In every animal, good proportion is best. And this is a word that was used by the sculptor Polykleitos in his treatise on proportion, which he called kanon. And the treatise is lost, but here's the manuscript. And let's see, there's the word συμμετρία. That's the London manuscript. So Polykleitos' text is lost, but it's quoted by Galen, who says that Polykleitos begins from the fingers and toes, and he compares the proportions of every part of the human body. And Galen uses the term συμμετρία. He reminds us that Polykleitos also produced a bronze statue created in accordance with the precepts that he outlined in the treatise on proportion, and that this statue is called kanon, like the treatise. So, there are many marble copies of the kanon or the Doryphoros, but this one is a modern one made of bronze. It's in the university in Munich, and it was made from casts of the best marble copies. So, Ernst Curtius, in his history of the city of Athens, suggested, without any explanation, that Simon's horse was a perfect specimen along the lines of Polykleitos' kanon. And he doesn't explain how he came to these conclusions, but I think if you look at Simon's text and his use of this keyword συμμετρία, that it's a guess that shouldn't be that maybe should be taken a little seriously. That shouldn't be immediately discarded. So we'll try and imagine the bronze horse there on its sculpted base. So after his discussion of generalities, color, size, and place of origin, Simon turns to point-by-point discussion of the horse's anatomy. And this book is a classic work on the conformation of the horse. It runs to about 700 pages. Simon covers the same ground in 2 pages, but he does a pretty good job. Now, Simon starts with the hoof, and here's a picture of Stella visiting the premises here with Maria and Jennifer on board. And Stella was newly shod with her hoofs trimmed and oiled for the occasion. And she wears special non-slip plastic shoes, but ancient Athenian horses were not shod. So you see why Simon insists that a good hoof is an asset to a horse, and why he begins his discussion with the hoof. He says that the horn of the hoof, that's the nail part, should be thick, and that the hoof should be hollow and not fleshy. He doesn't use the technical anatomical term for the frog, which is the fleshy triangle in the middle of the hoof, which later writers use. Xenophon calls it helidon, other authors call it vatrachos. But Simon just says that the proof of a good hoof, of a strong hoof, is its sound, that it rings like a cymbal, like the clash of a cymbal. Kymvalizi is the Greek word. And then he continues and he says that the cannon bones should be shaggy, that the horse should not walk like a dog on flat feet, and that the lower leg should be sinewy and not fleshy, but above the knee it should be fleshier and muscled. Then he continues to the chest. He says it shouldn't be too broad or too narrow, and the neck shouldn't be short. He says that the neck should be narrow at the point where it joins the head, and that it should curve backwards. The crest should be high, the head should be held high, he says, that it should be lightly dished or slightly concave, with big nostrils, big eyes, small teeth, small ears, and a small chin, and that the neck shouldn't be short. And here's the beautiful horse head that was one of the stars of the show before it went back to Florence. In fact, you can read Simon's description of the points of the horse, both as a description of an ideal real horse and as a sort of ekphrasis of a statue almost. So he continues and says that the withers should be as high as possible, and that the haunches should be massive, that the gaskin should be muscled, but not too fleshy, and the tail should be held high, and it should be long and with long hair. And then he says, so much for the points of the horse. The best horse, the Aristos, is the one that has all of these characteristics. But then he's realistic and he says the second best horse will have most of them. And then we have what seems to be the beginning of the next chapter, which discusses the physical development and early training of the colt. And so Simon says, the colt should be taken away from the breeding herd at age 2, and by 30 months it will get its first teeth. And so he goes on with careful observations of when the teeth come in, and he says the horse will be at the prime of its life at age 6, when it's swiftest and most daring. And sadly, the text breaks off there. So Pliny, who also wrote about the points of the horse, says, well, Virgil wrote very beautifully on the subject, I wrote on it too, and just about every author seems to agree on the subject. And of course, this is partly because standards of healthy, desirable conformation in a horse don't change. But it's also because the texts are dependent on one another. And in fact, if you put them side by side, as Eugen Oder did a long time ago, beginning with Simon and then continuing with Xenophon, Varro, Columella, the Roman agricultural writers, the Geoponica or Greek Farmer's Almanac, and then Palladius, another Roman agricultural writer, and then the poets, Virgil, Nemesius, Oppian, and so on. You see that they all agree, and in fact they use pretty much the same terminology as Simon. So he's at the origin of this important tradition. Xenophon tells us that he is repeating Simon's text, and he quotes him by name. He quotes him by name with regard to the sound of the hoof. He also says, Simon says that what a horse does under compulsion is never graceful. It's as though you would whip and spur a dancer. We know that Simon used the text very thoroughly. Pollux also mined it very thoroughly as a source of good Attic usage. And from him, we learn not only the story of Simon's criticism of the painter Mikon, but also he gives us a few excerpts from later in the book, from the part that's more on horsemanship. And so he says, the horse's gait is best when it's close to the ground, when it doesn't lift its legs too high, so it's more efficient. He also says that a young horse should be accustomed to varying terrain during its training. And then Simon's work appears in the agricultural compilers and the veterinary authors. The missing link here is the agricultural compilation of Cassius Dionysius, which is lost, but we know a certain amount about it. There was a very famous treatise on agriculture by Mago of Carthage, and it was written in Punic. And after the fall of Carthage in 146, the Roman Senate ordered this text to be translated into Latin. I mean, it was considered that useful. And then around 88 BC, Cassius Dionysius translated it, possibly again directly from the Punic, into Greek. But he added to it a lot of Greek authorities, and that's how Xenophon's work and Simon's work, because they both seem to have figured in it, entered the realm of agricultural authors. And Cassius Dionysius' text seems to have had ideal descriptions of every farm animal, not just horses, but also cows and goats and sheep and so on. And they are repeated in Diophanes, who made an abridged version of this very long and bulky agricultural manual, Anatolius and Cassianus Bassus, who are the sources of the Byzantine Geoponica that has come down to us. And then Cassius Dionysius also seems to have been a source for the late antique veterinary writers Apsyrtus, who was a Roman army horse doctor, probably in the 4th century. Hierocles, who was not a horse doctor, but a Roman lawyer who wrote a treatise on horse medicine, which just sort of plagiarized Apsyrtus and put it into higher style. And then Theomnestus, who is another army doctor who traveled with the Emperor Licinius in the early 4th century. And here, for example, you can see, Simon uses this word kymbalizi. Xenophon repeats and says that the strong hoof osper kymbalon psophi, it sounds like a cymbal. And here Theomnestus in the 4th century AD says kymbalodi tinatonichon tes estises iton akuondon parechi. So it's much more wordy, but he says the good hoof gives off the sound of a cymbal to the senses of the listeners. So, how in both the Cambridge and the London manuscripts, Simon's text is part of this encyclopedia of horse medicine. How did he doesn't seem to have written anything about medicine himself, about the medical treatment of horses, but how does his text get into this huge compilation? I mean, the Hippiatrica is sort of cut and pasted from the works of 7 authors, 7 veterinary authors. And it's a big compilation with about 100 chapters, and they go through ailment by ailment with this double organization. So here's, for example, the chapter on cough, and you have excerpts from all 7 authors listed more or less in alphabetical order according to the first letter in Greek of the author's name. And so it's a way of getting not just a second opinion, but also a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th. And so, useful if you're a horse doctor, although sometimes confusing because you have too many opinions, but also useful for comparing the literary styles of the texts. And this sort of compilation has its roots in scholarly activity of late antiquity, the gathering of texts into corpora, the comparison or synkrisis of texts, and the gathering of extracts from different texts into florilegia. And the first type of such compilations appear in the disciplines of medicine and the law. So there's the Medical Encyclopedia of Oribasius, and the Theodosian Code is a well-known example. And those are, of course, disciplines that require of their practitioners a familiarity with a huge volume of technical literature. So this is a way to try and cut all of that literature down to manageable form, so you can look up a subject and find what different authors have to say about it. And here in this famous 6th century manuscript of Dioscorides in Vienna, you can see a kind of composite scholia, which are related to this type of compilation. So here is Dioscorides' text on the asphodel, and then in the lower margin you have excerpts from 2 other authors, Galen and Craterus, on the same plant. So you have 3 opinions presented on the same page. And here's a 10th century copy of Dioscorides in the Morgan Library in New York. And at this point, the same scholia have been integrated into the main body of the text. So you have Dioscorides' text here and Galen's opinion right below it. So a sort of embryonic form of the encyclopedia. And the Hippiatrica is our main source of information about horse care and medicine from late antiquity on. And it was probably first assembled in late antiquity because the authors all seem to belong to that period. They use a lot of Latin loanwords in their text, and they allude to Roman institutions. And of course, around that time, in, say, the 4th or 5th century, horses were absolutely essential for the functioning of 3 great institutions of the Roman state: the army, the hippodrome, and the public post. And they all required quantities of horses and obviously horse care. So it was important to have veterinary texts too. So we don't know whether, here's an aerial view of Istanbul, and you can see the Byzantine hippodrome down there. Now, the Hippiatrica may have been assembled first in late antiquity, but it was re-edited in the 10th century during a movement of re-editing of compilations, and late antique compilations, and the creation of new ones on their model. And so this happened in the scriptorium of the Great Palace, which, the Great Palace covers this area under the Blue Mosque and downhill from St. Sophia. And the hippodrome was still important in the 10th century, although races were on a much smaller scale than before. And of course, the empire had contracted, so you couldn't bring horses from Libya or Spain anymore. But in the meantime, a new equestrian sport, polo, had been adopted by the Byzantines. And so there was a polo field in the Great Palace, and that was somewhere around there. There was also one here in Athens, probably near where the central market is. So this movement of re-editing compilations was carried out under the aegis of the Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, whom you see in this ivory. And he, for the edification of his son Romanos, had encyclopedias compiled on statecraft and history and military tactics and agriculture. I'm afraid Romanos didn't live up to his father's expectations. But anyway, the Hippiatrica, the veterinary encyclopedia, was re-edited at this time too. And here's a copy of that re-edition. It's in Berlin. It belonged to Thomas Phillips, the bibliomane. And it has been identified as a product of the imperial scriptorium of Constantine VII on the basis of its size. I mean, it's enormous. The quality of its parchment, its beautiful, pretentious calligraphy. I mean, you see these curlicued letters here, absurd peripiretu, absurdus on fever, chapter 51. And then, of course, this gold decoration, which is almost on every page, and it looks like enamel. And remember, this is a text on sick horses, and it talks about mud and blood and leeches and manure and things like that. But it's really a very, very beautiful and lavishly produced kind of coffee table book. Now, the Cambridge and London manuscripts of the Hippiatrica that contain Simon's text are both based on the text of this 10th century reedition. The text was of the late antique veterinary authors was sort of polished. Latin loanwords were replaced with Greek words. It was the same treatment that was given to the lives of saints, the so-called metaphrasis. It doesn't really make sense for technical manuals, but anyway, the Cambridge and London manuscripts have this polished text, and they also have a bunch of other sources added in, and these sources were used, they were sort of recycled among many of the compilations produced for Constantine Porphyrogenitus. So, for example, excerpts from the Kestoi of Julius Africanus, these kind of crazy texts which have magic and science and eccentric advice, they were used in the Hippiatrica and also in the compilation on military tactics. This list of horse breeds, going, by place of origin, Armenians, Arabs, Thessalians, Cappadocians, Libyans, Sicilians, and so on, that was added to the Hippiatrica, but also to the bestiary of Constantine VII. Then the medical compilation of Theophanes Chrysovalandis, which was produced in the 10th century, using extracts from ancient physicians, was also recycled, and excerpts from that medieval medical manual were added to the Hippiatrica and appear in the Cambridge and London manuscripts. So there seems to have been a lot of recycling of, cut and pasted scraps of paper or parchment in the imperial scriptorium. And then, of course, there's the Suda, and all of the excerpts relating to the Hippiatrica and to Simon in the Suda seem to refer to this 10th century recension, and they're very sloppily compiled indeed. Simon is mixed up with the statesman Kimon, because they're both Athenian. And so Kimon is said to have written a marvelous book on looking at horses. And then where Simon is mentioned under his own name, he's credited with a discussion of veins, which actually comes from another author, but it appears in the Cambridge and London manuscripts close to his text. So you think the compilers of the Suda really could have used a good word processor. And it also shows us that we can't rely on its testimony about Simon, because when the Suda says Simon wrote a book on horse medicine, it actually means we found a text attributed to Simon the Athenian in a compilation of veterinary texts. So these Cambridge and London manuscripts have not only the earliest text that was added to the Hippiatrica, that's Simon's, but they also have the latest text, which gives us a date for when this recension of the Hippiatrica was produced. And that is a pair of recipes attributed to the patriarch Theophylact. And there you can see his name up there. It says Theophylactu Patriarchu. And he was an interesting character, son of the usurper Romanos Lekapinos. He was raised to the patriarchal throne at age 16, and he was notorious for his hippomania. Byzantine historians say that Theophylact left St. Sophia in the middle of the liturgy to attend to his favorite mare who was giving birth. And here in this Madrid manuscript of the historian Skelitsis, you can see the patriarch, the mare, and the newborn foal. So a remedy attributed to him appears, or two remedies rather, appear in the Cambridge and London manuscripts. And so we can tell that Simon's text entered the Hippiatric compilation, was tacked onto it in the 10th century in the context of the imperial scriptorium, when all of these interesting ancient scraps were being used and recycled between new compilations. And it may have been just, one leaf of parchment, 2 sides of a page. I wish there had been more. It may be that the 10th century poet John Geometres was reading the text because his little poem on horses also begins with a hoof, and it uses some of the same terminology that Simon uses. So he talks about the hollow hoof, the thick horn of the hoof, the resounding hoof, and so on. And then the small chin, for example. And so it may be that he had had a look at Simon's text before composing his own work. Then there's another poem on the same subject, on the points of the horse, that is preserved in 3 manuscripts of the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. And it is actually attributed to Simon, along with Xenophon and Apsyrtus, who is the most famous of the late antique horse doctors. And of course, this attribution is nonsense, but it shows that Simon's reputation persisted. I mean, he and Xenophon probably would have fainted if they saw this poem with its vernacular vocabulary for the anatomy of the horse and its stress-based dodecasyllabic verse. But they might have admitted that the advice it gives is pretty good, and that it's based on their own texts. It's part of the same tradition. So much for the Byzantine period. What happened next? I mean, after the fall of Constantinople, Greek scholars went to the west and brought books with them. And here's Janus Lascaris. He owned the earliest manuscript of the Hippiatrica and annotated it from beginning to end. He's there with Pope Leo X, who was Cosimo de' Medici. And Lascaris went on missions into Ottoman territory to buy books on behalf of Lorenzo de' Medici, who was his great patron. And he kept very careful lists of the books that he purchased. And so we know that in Corfu in 1491, he bought a medical book that also contained the Tactica of Leo. And here's the book. it's the Hippiatrica and the Tactica together in a single volume. It's still in Florence, still with the chain attached. And it has a list of all the authors selected out. And Lascaris was very keen on advertising how many Greek authors he had brought to Italy, and he made lists of those too. And so here we see all the veterinary authors. This manuscript doesn't have Simon in it. Lascaris would have been thrilled to have a classical text. But he made a big deal over these Greek veterinary authors. And Lascaris was also instrumental in having the Hippiatrica not only copied in Greek by his students, but also translated into Italian and eventually into Latin for its first publication, which was dedicated to the French King Francis I, whom Lascaris met on a battlefield as an envoy from Pope Leo X. So Lascaris probably gave him a copy of the Hippiatrica, and it was translated by the king's personal physician, Jean Ruel, and here's a little epigram by Lascaris on Ruel, the translator. But Lascaris, he was not only keen on bringing Greek authors to Italy, but he was also keen on currying favor with his patron Lorenzo de' Medici, and Lorenzo was crazy about horses, so Lascaris not only bought him a manuscript of the Greek Encyclopedia of Horse Medicine, but he also got him 2 copies of Xenophon. And here's a letter from Lorenzo to his chief groom, and it talks about a racehorse who has swollen knees and maybe shouldn't be raced because he might get hurt even more. And Poliziano, the humanist, also wrote a poem about Lorenzo's horse craziness. And of course, Lorenzo owned this beautiful head, which was featured in the exhibition, which, like the fragment of Simon in the Hippiatrica, was a sort of antiquarian treasure. And so I hope that you agree that Simon's text is interesting, not just for the history of Greek and for the history of horsemanship, but also in the history of art. And I hope that you'll go and read it. I'd like to end, coming from Florence back to Athens, the heir to all this great tradition, starting with Simon and continuing with Xenophon and the veterinary authors and agricultural authors and so on, is George Stavridis, who has the last horse in downtown Athens. And I urge you to go and take a ride in the carriage by the Acropolis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, for taking us from the 5th century BC to, Athens today, but also, a special thanks on behalf of the Gennadius for talking about Lascaris and the fate of these wonderful manuscripts, but also reminding us or talking about the compilation of texts and all this very, very important and interesting transmission of ancient texts, Greek texts, through Byzantium. So we have this hybrid event, so we can have questions from the audience, and we can have questions, of course, online. And I urge the people who are online to pose their questions in the Q&A, but we have a question in the back here. No, I think it's important that people actually who are online can listen to you.
Thank you, Dr. McCabe, for this interesting talk. In your research on the recension and reception of Simon's text, does anyone polemically cite Simon and disagree with him?
No, not that I know of. Everyone seems to agree that his advice is good. I mean, we only have a very small fragment of the text, and of course, a lot of the later mentions are indirect through the agricultural compilations, but nothing critical.
Thank you so much, Anne, and also for writing about Cimon for a forthcoming book on bilingual book on horses, which is about to appear, which was written in conjunction with the exhibition. I'm particularly interested in the fact that Cimon dedicated this horse statue in the Eleusinion. I'd be curious what he thinks his feats were. Was it writing the book, or did he have other equestrian feats? Do you think he was a cavalryman? And in light of the Eleusinion, of course, it's the place where the Apobates race stopped, which is one of the most spectacular hippic events in the Agora, held at the Panathenea. But there's even a more interesting connection, I think, which is with this, one of the eponymous heroes of Athens was named Hippothon. And of course, he was sired, like all horsey heroes, by Poseidon. I can't remember what happened to his mother, but he was suckled by a mare. That's sort of this Romulus and Remus story about him, and we have a picture of a vase in the exhibition showing that. But if you read about his connections, his geographical connections are all with Eleusis. So he seems to have had his hero shrine there. He might have been worshipped there. He might have been, we don't really know. And of course, I don't know of any connection between Demeter and Korai with horses other than in Arcadia, which has odd things, but religious things. But so I just wonder if he didn't know of this connection, or whether that may even have been his tribe. I guess we'll never know that, but I just think it's interesting that he chose the Eleusinion.
Well, as a Byzantinist, I'm out of my depth in classical Athens, so it's very interesting, and of course, you know, horses eat a lot of grain, and so the connection with Demeter and with agriculture is you know, something to think about.
There is a very specific question from online. Could Pliny's equitem Simonem mean the knight Simon and not Simon on a horse?
It could, of course.
Okay.
But in that case, it would be a different statue, a statue of the man, and not Simon's own dedication.
Okay.
Which is possible.
There are two questions here in front.
Is there any indication?
We cannot hear you. Yeah.
Is there any indication, the two manuscripts from the 14th century, where the information in those came from? Is there any indication as to the transmission, how these two manuscripts suddenly appeared?
I think that the recension that they belong to, you know, one isn't derived from the other, they seem to have a common archetype. It seems to have its origin in the 10th century, based on maybe the rough draft of that very splendid imperial manuscript, because I imagine that the whole work of metaphrasis, of going through and polishing the text, wasn't done immediately, you know, in the fine copy. So there must have been a rough draft kicking around the imperial scriptorium, and that was used maybe not too much later, and other material was added to it that also happened to be lying around the same place, you know, the excerpts from Julius Africanus, the remedies of the patriarch Theophylact, and Simon's text.
Kosti, did you have a question?
Related to the last question, what evidence do we have about how widely were these manuscripts used, circulating? Who owned them, used them? Do you have any evidence?
There's a great diversity. I mean, the Hippiatrica, it's a very technical text, but it's interesting for many reasons. You know, it has descriptions of diseases, so it has the technical language of medicine, very rich vocabulary. It also has magic in it. It has a lot of pharmacology, descriptions of plants and even more exotic substances used as drugs. It has a variety of letter forms, including collections of, epistolographic collections, treatises that were composed as a collection of letters. It has rhetorical proemia. It has the descriptions of symptoms and then prescriptions for cure, and then it has simple recipes that don't have any syntax at all. So there's a lot in it that could appeal to a variety of people. So we see the coffee table version, which was prepared for an emperor, and of course horses were part of the imperial image, the hippodrome, the polo field, and so on in the 10th century. But then you have humble copies like the Cambridge manuscript, which could have been used in the barn, and heavily stained and annotated and so on, intended for practical use. And there are more than 20 copies of the Hippiatrica, and they're very, very diverse in nature. Some were annotated by classical scholars like Laskaris, and some were used by vets. So yeah, all sorts of information.
Could I ask you, the word kimvalizo, kimvalizis, is this a word that is used often? And obviously here it was used for the hoof, but how is the word used normally?
Well, for playing the cymbals, so
Okay.
in a kind of musical context. So I don't know what that tells us about Simon. Did he enjoy music or a party? Anyway, it's a vivid expression, and it was certainly picked up by many later authors. So it's interesting.
And could you also say a little bit? You said about the manuscript where you had the glossing, the sort of that the ancient words were or translated or explained. What was the simpler words? What were they?
Well, it's a bit like if you or I pick up Simon's text, we would probably have to look up a few of the words in the dictionary. We might write them into our copy of the book. It's like that. I can go back and we can look at some of the. Would you like to look at some of the specific ones?
No. I was. It was very interesting to me that 150 years later, that sort of new words were needed, or something that presumably was understood in the 14th century when the copy was made. Somehow, in the 15th century, it was no longer, or whoever used it. Yes.
In fact, the copyist did trip up on a lot of the words and grammatical forms. The copyist of the Cambridge manuscript made a lot of mistakes. And then, of course, the text in the 15th century was already 2,000 years old, and so it's excusable, I think, for the reader, and especially if it was a horse doctor or someone who couldn't be expected to have the classical vocabulary at his fingertips. But it's interesting. It would be an interesting exercise to go through and collect them just as evidence of what people didn't understand at the time, but I haven't done it.
Any other questions? Well, I think then we should thank you very much for a very interesting and lively talk that truly painted a very important picture of a text or a version of a text as it moves through time. And for those of us who are here in Cotton Hall, I would like to invite you for a glass of wine, and then we can talk to Anne close up. Thank you very much.